The Gift of Therapy, Chapter 1, Removing the Obstacles to Growth. When I was finding my way as a young psychotherapy student, the most useful book I read was Karen Horney's Neurosis and Human Growth. And the single most useful concept in that book was the notion that the human being has an inbuilt propensity towards self realization. If obstacles are removed, Horney believed, the individual will develop into a mature, fully realized adult, just as an acorn will develop into an oak tree. Just as an acorn develops into an oak. What a wonderfully liberating and clarifying image. It forever changed my approach to psychotherapy by offering me a new vision of my work. My task was to remove obstacles blocking my patient's path. I did not have to do the entire job. I did not have to inspirit the patient with a desire to grow, with curiosity, will, zest for life, caring, loyalty, or any of the myriad of characteristics that make us fully human. No, what I had to do was to identify and remove obstacles. The rest would follow automatically, fueled by the self actualizing forces within the patient. I remember a young widow with, as she put it, a quote unquote failed heart, an inability ever to love again. It felt daunting to address the inability to love. I didn't know how to do that, but dedicating myself to identifying and uprooting her many blocks to loving, I could do that. I soon learned that love felt treasonous to her. To love another was to betray her dead husband. It felt to her like pounding the final nails in her husband's coffin. To love another as deeply as she did her husband, and she would settle for nothing less, meant that her love for her husband had been in some way insufficient or flawed. To love another would be self destructive because loss and the searing pain of loss was inevitable. To love again felt irresponsible. She was evil and jinxed, and her kiss was the kiss of death. We worked hard for many months to identify all these obstacles to her loving another man. For months, we wrestled with each irrational obstacle in turn. But once that was done, the patient's internal processes took over. She met a man. She fell in love. She married again. I didn't have to teach her to search, to give, to cherish, to love. I wouldn't have known how to do that. A few words about Karen Horney. Her name is unfamiliar to most young therapists. Because the shelf life of eminent theorists in our field has grown so short, I shall from time to time lapse into reminiscence, not merely for the sake of paying homage, but to emphasize the point that our field has a long history of remarkably able contributors who have laid deep foundations for our therapy work today. One uniquely American addition to psychodynamic theory is embodied in the Neo Freudian movement, a group of clinicians and theorists who reacted against Freud's original focus on drive theory, that is, the notion that the developing individual is largely controlled by the unfolding and expression of inbuilt drives. Instead, the Neo Freudians emphasized that we consider the vast influence of the interpersonal environment that envelops the individual and that throughout life shapes character structure. The best known interpersonal theorists, Harry Stack Sullivan, Eric Fromm, and Karen Horney, have been so deeply integrated and assimilated into our therapy language and practice that we are all, without knowing it, Neo Freudians. One is reminded of Monsieur Jourdain in Moliere's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, who, upon learning the definition of prose, exclaims with wonderment, "To think that all my life I've been speaking prose without knowing it." Chapter 2. Avoid diagnosis, except for insurance companies. Today's psychotherapy students are exposed to too much emphasis on diagnosis. Managed care administrators demand that therapists arrive quickly at a precise diagnosis and then proceed upon a course of brief, focused therapy that matches that particular diagnosis. Sounds good, sounds logical and efficient, but it has precious little to do with reality. It represents instead an illusory attempt to legislate scientific precision into being when it is neither possible nor desirable. Though diagnosis is unquestionably critical in treatment considerations for many severe conditions with a biological substrate, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, major affective disorders, temporal lobe epilepsy, drug toxicity, organic or brain disease from toxins, degenerative causes, or infectious agents, diagnosis is often counterproductive in the everyday psychotherapy of less severely impaired patients. Why? For one thing, psychotherapy consists of a gradual unfolding process wherein the therapist attempts to know the patient as fully as possible. A diagnosis limits vision, it diminishes ability to relate to the other as a person. Once we make a diagnosis, we tend to selectively inattend to aspects of the patient that do not fit into that particular diagnosis, and correspondingly overattend to subtle features that appear to confirm an initial diagnosis. What's more, a diagnosis may act as a self fulfilling prophecy. Relating to a patient as a borderline or a hysteric may serve to stimulate and perpetuate those very traits. Indeed, there is a long history of iatrogenic influence on the shape of clinical entities, including the current controversy about multiple personality disorder and repressed memories of sexual abuse. And keep in mind, too, the low reliability of the DSM personality disorder category, the very patients often engaging in longer term psychotherapy. And what therapist has not been struck by how much easier it is to make a DSM 4 diagnosis following the first interview than much later, let's say, after the 10th session, when we know a great deal more about the individual? Is this not a strange kind of science? A colleague of mine brings this point home to his psychiatric residents by asking, if you are in personal psychotherapy or are considering it, what DSM 4 diagnosis do you think your therapist could justifiably use to describe someone as complicated as you? In the therapeutic enterprise, we must tread a fine line between some but not too much objectivity. If we take the DSM diagnostic system too seriously, if we really believe we are truly carving at the joints of nature, then we may threaten the human, the spontaneous, the creative, and uncertain nature of the therapeutic venture. Remember that the clinicians involved in formulating previous, now discarded diagnostic systems were competent, proud, and just as confident as the current members of the DSM committees. Undoubtedly, the time will come when the DSM 4 Chinese restaurant menu format will appear ludicrous to mental health professionals. Chapter 3: Therapist and Patient as Fellow Travelers. André Malraux, the French novelist, described a country priest who had taken confession for many decades and summed up what he had learned about human nature in this manner. First of all, people are much more unhappy than one thinks, and there is no such thing as a grown up person. Everyone, and that includes therapists as well as patients, is destined to experience not only the exhilaration of life, but also its inevitable darkness, disillusionment, aging, illness, isolation, loss, meaninglessness, painful choices, and death. No one puts things more starkly and more bleakly than the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. In early youth, as we contemplate our coming life, we are like children in a theater before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin. It is a blessing that we do not know what is really going to happen. Could we foresee it, there are times when children might seem like condemned prisoners, condemned not to death but to life, and as yet all unconscious of what their sentence means. Or again, we are like lambs in the field, disporting themselves under the eyes of the butcher, who picks out one first and then another for his prey. So it is that in our good days we are all unconscious of the evil that fate may have presently in store for us: sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight or reason. Though Schopenhauer's view is colored heavily by his own personal unhappiness, still it is difficult to deny the inbuilt despair in the life of every self conscious individual. My wife and I have sometimes amused ourselves by planning imaginary dinner parties for groups of people sharing similar propensities. For example, a party for monopolists, or flaming narcissists, or artful passive aggressives we have known, or conversely, a quote unquote happy party to which we invite only the truly happy people we have encountered. Though we've encountered no problems fulfilling all sorts of other whimsical tables, we have never been able to populate a full table for our happy people party. Each time we identify a few characterologically cheerful people and place them on a waiting list while we continue our search to complete the table, We find that one or another of our happy guests is eventually stricken by some major life adversity, often a severe illness, or that of a child or spouse. This tragic but realistic view of life has long influenced my relationship to those who seek my help. Though there are many phrases for the therapeutic relationship, patient therapist, client counselor, analysand analyst, client facilitator, and the latest and by far the most repulsive, user provider, none of these phrases accurately convey my sense of the therapeutic relationship. Instead, I prefer to think of my patients and myself as fellow travelers, a term that abolishes distinctions between quote unquote them, the afflicted, and quote unquote us, the healers. During my training, I was often exposed to the idea of the fully analyzed therapist. But as I have progressed through life, formed intimate relationships with a good many of my therapist colleagues, met the senior figures in the field, been called upon to render help to my former therapists and teachers, and myself become a teacher and an elder, I have come to realize the mythic nature of this idea. We are all in this together, and there is no therapist and no person immune to the inherent tragedies of existence. One of my favorite tales of healing, found in Hermann Hesse's Magister Ludi, involves Joseph and Dion, two renowned healers who lived in biblical times. Though both were highly effective, they worked in different ways. The younger healer, Joseph, healed through quiet, inspired listening. Pilgrims trusted Joseph. Suffering and anxiety poured into his ears vanished like water on the desert sand, and penitents left his presence emptied and calmed. On the other hand, Dion, the older healer, actively confronted those who sought his help. He divined their unconfessed sins. He was a great judge, chastiser, scolder, and rectifier, and he healed through active intervention. Treating the penitents as children, he gave advice, punished by assigning penance, ordered pilgrimages and marriages, and compelled enemies to make up. The two healers never met, and they worked as rivals for many years until Joseph grew spiritually ill, fell into dark despair, and was assailed with ideas of self-destruction. Unable to heal himself with his own therapeutic methods, he set out on a journey to the south to seek help from Dion. On his pilgrimage, Joseph rested one evening at an oasis, where he fell into a conversation with an older traveler. When Joseph described the purpose and destination of his pilgrimage, the traveler offered himself as a guide to assist in the search for Dion. Later, in the midst of their long journey together, the old traveler revealed his identity to Joseph. Mirabile dictu, he himself was Dion, the very man Joseph sought. Without hesitation, Dion invited his younger, despairing rival into his home, where they lived and worked together for many years. Dion first asked Joseph to be a servant. Later, he elevated him to a student, and finally to full colleagueship. Years later, Dion fell ill, and on his deathbed called his young colleague to him in order to hear a confession. He spoke of Joseph's earlier terrible illness and his journey to old Dion to plead for help. He spoke of how Joseph had felt it was a miracle that his fellow traveler and guide turned out to be Dion himself. Now that he was dying, the hour had come. Dion told Joseph to break his silence about that miracle. Dion confessed that at the time it had seemed a miracle to him as well, for he too had fallen into despair. He too felt empty and spiritually dead, and unable to help himself had set off on a journey to seek help. On the very night that they had met at the oasis, he was on a pilgrimage to a famous healer named Joseph. Hesse's tale has always moved me in a preternatural way. It strikes me as a deeply illuminating statement about giving and receiving help, about honesty and duplicity, and about the relationship between healer and patient. The two men received powerful help, but in different ways. The younger healer was nurtured, nursed, taught, mentored, and parented. The older healer, on the other hand, was helped through serving another, through obtaining a disciple from whom he received filial love, respect, and salve for his isolation. But now, reconsidering the story, I question whether these two wounded healers could not have been of even more service to one another. Perhaps they missed the opportunity for something deeper, more authentic, more powerfully mutative. Perhaps the real therapy occurred at the deathbed scene, when they moved into honesty with the revelation that they were fellow travelers, both simply human, all too human. The 20 years of secrecy, helpful as they were, may have obstructed and prevented a more profound kind of help. What might have happened if Dion's deathbed confession had occurred 20 years earlier, if healer and seeker had joined together in facing the questions that have no answers? All of this echoes Rilke's letters to a young poet, in which he advises, have patience with everything unresolved and try to love the questions themselves. I would add, try to love the questioners as well. Chapter 4. Engage the patient. A great many of our patients have conflicts in the realm of intimacy and obtain help in therapy sheerly through experiencing an intimate relationship with the therapist. Some fear intimacy because they believe there is something basically unacceptable about them, something repugnant and unforgivable. Given this, the act of revealing oneself fully to another and still being accepted may be the major vehicle of therapeutic help. Others may avoid intimacy because of fears of exploitation, colonization, or abandonment. For them, too, the intimate and caring therapeutic relationship that does not result in the anticipated catastrophe becomes a corrective emotional experience. Hence, nothing takes precedence over the care and maintenance of my relationship to the patient, and I attend carefully to every nuance of how we regard each other. Does the patient seem distant today? Competitive? Inattentive to my comments? Does he make use of what I say in private but refuse to acknowledge my help openly? Is she overly respectful? Obsequious? Too rarely voicing any objection or disagreements? Detached or suspicious? Do I enter his dreams or daydreams? What are the words of imaginary conversations with me? All these things I want to know and more. I never let an hour go by without checking into our relationship, sometimes with a simple statement like, "How are you and I doing today?" Or, "How are you experiencing the space between us today?" Sometimes I ask the patient to project herself into the future. Imagine a half hour from now. You're on your drive home, looking back upon our session. How will you feel about you and me today? What will be the unspoken statements or unasked questions about our relationship today? Chapter 5. Be supportive. One of the great values of obtaining intensive personal therapy is to experience for oneself the great value of positive support. Question: what do patients recall when they look back years later on their experience in therapy? Answer: not insight, not the therapist's interpretations. More often than not, they remember the positive support statements of their therapist. I make a point of regularly expressing my positive thoughts and feelings about my patients along a wide range of attributes. For example, their social skills, intellectual curiosity, warmth, loyalty to their friends, articulateness, courage in facing their inner demons, dedication to change, willingness to self-disclose, loving gentleness with their children, commitment to breaking the cycle of abuse, and decision not to pass on the hot potato to the next generation. Don't be stingy. There's no point to it. There is every reason to express these observations and your positive sentiments. And beware of empty compliments. Make your support as incisive as your feedback or interpretations. Keep in mind the therapist's great power that in part stems from our having been privy to our patient's most intimate life events, thoughts, and fantasies. Acceptance and support from one who knows you so intimately is enormously affirming. If patients make an important and courageous therapeutic step, compliment them on it. If I've been deeply engaged in the hour and regret that it's come to an end, I say that I hate to bring this hour to an end. And a confession: every therapist has a store of small secret transgressions. I do not hesitate to express this non-verbally by running over the hour a few minutes. Often the therapist is the only audience viewing great dramas and acts of courage. Such privilege demands a response to the actor. Though patients may have other confidants, none is likely to have the therapist's comprehensive appreciation of certain momentous acts. For example, years ago as a patient, Michael, a novelist, informed me one day that he had just closed his secret post office box. For years, this mailbox had been his method of communication in a long series of clandestine extramarital affairs. Hence, closing the box was a momentous act, and I considered it my responsibility to appreciate the great courage of his act and made a point of expressing to him my admiration for his action. A few months later, he was still tormented by recurring images and cravings for his last lover. I offered support. You know, Michael, the type of passion you experienced doesn't ever evaporate quickly. Of course, you're going to be revisited with longings. It's inevitable. That's part of your humanity. Part of my weakness, you mean? I wish I were a man of steel and could put her aside for good. We have a name for such men of steel, robots. And a robot, thank God, is what you are not. We've talked often about your sensitivity and your creativity. These are your richest assets. That's why your writing is so powerful, and that's why others are drawn to you. But these very traits have a dark side, anxiety. They make it impossible for you to live through such circumstances with equanimity. A lovely example of a reframed comment that provided much comfort to me occurred some time ago when I expressed my disappointment at a bad review of one of my books to a friend, William Blatty, the author of The Exorcist. He responded in a wonderfully supportive manner, which instantaneously healed my wound. Irv, of course you're upset by the review. Thank God for it. If you weren't so sensitive, you wouldn't be such a good writer. All therapists will discover their own way of supporting patients. I have an indelible image in my mind of Ram Dass describing his leave-taking from a guru with whom he had studied at an ashram in India for many years. When Ram Dass lamented that he was not ready to leave because of his many flaws and imperfections, his guru rose and slowly and very solemnly circled him in a close inspection tour, which he concluded with an official pronouncement, "I see no imperfections." I've never literally circled patients, visually inspecting them, and I never feel that the process of growth ever ends, but nonetheless, this image has often guided my comments. Support may include comments about appearance, some article of clothing, a well-rested, sun-tanned countenance, a new hairstyle. If a patient obsesses about physical unattractiveness, I believe the human thing to do is to comment, if one feels this way, that you consider him or her to be attractive, and to wonder about the origins of the myth of his or her unattractiveness. In a story about psychotherapy in Mama and the Meaning of Life, my protagonist, Dr. Ernest Lash, is cornered by an exceptionally attractive female patient who presses him with explicit questions. Am I appealing to men? To you? If you weren't my therapist, would you respond sexually to me? These are the ultimate nightmarish questions, the questions therapists dread above all others. It is the fear of such questions that causes many therapists to give too little of themselves. But I believe the fear is unwarranted. If you deem it in the patient's best interests, why not simply say, as my fictional character did, if everything were different, we met in another world, I were single, I weren't your therapist, then yes, I would find you very attractive and sure would make an effort to know you better. What's the risk? In my view, such candor simply increases the patient's trust in you and in the process of therapy. Of course, this does not preclude other types of inquiry about the question, about, for example, the patient's motivation or timing, the standard "why now?" question, or inordinate preoccupation with physicality or seduction, which may be obscuring even more significant questions.